the logistical manpower required to kind of successfully execute an operation like this. To what extent are like the police, the army, and other kind of official forces that would also have included Sikhs amongst other religions and communities, to what extent are they involved or not involved?
So the police was definitely involved. They were heavily involved. So their boss was Arun Nehru MP, who was the in charge of the Home Ministry. Um, so on the 31st of October, there was a call from his ministry for Sikh policemen to stand down and go home.
And
So
is
that was the
this sorry?
first.
I don't mean to interrupt, but as in just for the curiosity's sake, we're like in terms of location, where are we talking? And equally, is this before or after the assassinations taken place?
So this is after the assassination had taken place. A call had been made through the wires, the radio wires, to Sikh police to stand down and go home. So that was the first thing that took place. A
And
lot
this
of
is
this
in Delhi.
this is in Delhi, yeah. And then a lot of the Sikhs policemen actually were attacked on the night of 31st, and some of them went back on the 1st of November, and again they were attacked as well. So being a policeman didn't make any difference. So they took out the Sikh police who could have helped protect their community. Um, and then the police, particularly, so we got lots of evidence, particularly in the east of Delhi, in neighborhoods like Trilakpuri and Sultanpuri and Mughalpuri on the east and also on the west side of Delhi, where policemen actively took part in organizing mobs, directing mobs to Sikh homes and businesses. Um, Actually, they did a kind of a reconnaissance. First of all, they would go into Sikh areas, go to Sikh houses and confiscate licensed firearms and gurpans, and reassure Sikhs that they'd be protected by the Sikhs. Once that was done, they would then go and allow the mobs to go into those areas and start the killings. So they were without the police, this wouldn't have happened. Um, Absolutely. Very isolated cases where some policemen did protect Sikhs, but they were very isolated cases. There's a famous case of um, one police officer in Chandi Chowk in Delhi who just had to fire one revolver and the mobs just dispersed. I mean, if that's all it took to disperse those mobs. But on the whole, and we've got policemen on camera now admitting what took place. Orders given from the above to teach Sikhs a lesson, and the police were there to direct the mobs, and then also get rid of the evidence afterwards as well.
So, how do things or why do things come to a stop then towards the 3rd of November? Sometimes it's stated that it's essentially because the army is drafted in that brings things to a stop. Is that because they aren't under the same kind of line of command as the police, or like how do the dynamics of that work?
So they were under the same command. So they were under the command of the Home Minister, who was Narasimha Rao. Um, so basically, the mobs were given 3 days to carry out the genocide. The army was kept back for those 3 days. So we know from the testimonies of army chiefs that on the first day, there were orders not only from the Home Ministry but also from the Prime Minister's office not to intervene on the first night. On the second night, they were to just march in some of the areas, but none of the areas were affected. So they were marching down in South Delhi or somewhere else. It was only on the third that they went into the affected areas. But by that time, the genocide had already taken place. If you look at West Delhi and East Delhi, a lot of the Sikh neighborhoods had already been wiped out by that time. And many places that we now know of in Kanpur, in lots of other northern Indian places where Congress were in power, outskirts of Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, a lot of the places, there was no protection by the police, and the army was really late in coming into those areas. So those areas we didn't know about that at the time, and that was uncovered much later. But yeah, it was principally 3 days for the mobs to carry out, and then the army would come in.
You've already kind of answered my next question, which was whether it was just specifically targeted to Delhi, but as you said, it's not, and it's taken place in numerous other areas. One question then that I wanted to obviously pick your brain about was, what role does the media play in the immediate kind of decade or two that follows this?
So in India at the time, the TV was state owned, so Doordarshan was state owned. Um, All Indian Radio was state owned. So those two media outlets played a very important part in what took place at the time. So um, on the 31st of November and on the 31st of October and the 1st of November, there was telecast of Mrs. Gandhi's body um, at Deed Mundi House, continuous round the clock. At the same time, um, anti-Sikh hate mobs slogans were allowed to be aired at that time. So, the infamous Khoon ka badla khoon, blood for blood, could be clearly heard. And this was, aired on national TV, the only station India had throughout India. So you could just see how, you could see the tacit support from a state agency telling people blood for blood. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the national newspapers, on the whole, didn't cover the killings at all. And even if they did, they talked about 10 people here dead, 100 people here dead, even on the third day. And the only newspaper that actually covered the massacres was the Indian Express. But even the Indian Express refused to cover the mass rapes that had taken place as well. And, I talk about that in the book, where the editor said, no, do not cover this, even though it was taking place. I think generally on the whole, the media has taken the line of the government, which is that this was a spontaneous, unorganized riot that took place, and they haven't, and even to this day, properly investigated the truth of what essentially was a genocidal massacre, where Sikhs as a minority was targeted because they were Sikhs. Their gurdwaras were attacked on the 1st of November. Their scriptures were burnt publicly. Their hair was cut. So there was a real sort of clear-cut attack on Sikhi, not just Sikhs in general, but Sikhi, to erase their religion and culture, their offspring, the women folk, to damage women and girls for generations to come in terms of sexual violence. And that story has never been told. And the numbers that they talked about as well, they never investigated that this went into the thousands, and the cremations that took place, and the postmortems, they never covered those. They never covered the fact that a lot of hospitals closed their doors to Sikh victims, burn victims. A lot of burn units were shut when actually the main injury to Sikhs were burns. Many Sikhs were attacked outside hospitals as well. There were mobs that were waiting outside. Doctors refused to, and this is all documented in my book. Even head doctors, admitted that they were told not to treat Sikhs at the time. So lots of Sikhs died as a consequence as well. The fire brigade was not sent to Sikh neighborhoods. The calls of Sikhs on the telephones were unheard, completely ignored until the third day. So um, you can literally see, if you look at some of the maps that I have in the book, the areas that were affected completely wiped out, and those Sikh neighborhoods don't exist anymore, particularly in West and East Delhi. And those Sikhs who did manage to survive are now in areas in other parts of Delhi. So those areas were ethnically cleansed.
In your book, in particularly in your chapter, I think it's called Body Count, you do a really good job of kind of compiling all of the different lists in terms of reports and estimations of those that were murdered or impacted by the carnage that unfolded over those few days. This is obviously, in some respects, kind of a rhetorical question, but do you kind of expect that we'll ever know the true extent of what actually happened during those few days? Like, your book is incredible in terms of putting together a very comprehensive picture, but it just sounds like there was so much involved in terms of the logistics, the planning, even the execution of something like this. Do you think we'll ever really know the true extent of what took place?
No, I don't think so. It was so widespread, and there's many areas that weren't covered by the official but also unofficial reports, human rights reports. There's a lot of areas where outer skirts of villages in Haryana, in northern India, the violence that took place on the trains and the buses were never covered. It's only years later that we found out there were massacres that took place in those areas. I, I think my main aim was to create a body of work that was evidence based. And it was really important that I was focused on evidence and witness testimony. And I didn't want to go outside that and make assumptions and presumptions, because I think this was a really important work that had come after being part of trying to get justice for the victims. And I felt that there was nothing really comprehensive evidence-based work that you can bring all the evidence together. I mean, there were various eyewitnesses. People have written books in India, in particular, from their point of view of their area. The official accounts didn't cover everything. Some of the human rights reports were only based in Delhi and no other areas. So I wanted to really bring together the whole picture as much as I can, covering not just the killing, but also looking at how Gurdwaras was attacked first, how the police was used, the army was kept at the barracks, how rape was used during those days, and also looking at the official inquiries. So we had two major inquiries, the Misra and the Nanavati, and I really looked into detail at exactly what took place, the witness testimonies, and which were used, which were ignored. And you could see a clear line that those official inquiries still followed that official line of being a riot. And so they discounted rape, they discounted the organization, they didn't want to look at the role of Arun Nehru or the chief police officers at the time, what they were doing. They completely discounted that. They were saying, even at the Nanavati, saying that maybe there was some organization that was behind it, but actually didn't identify who that was, who they were. So there's a lot of areas that are still to this day not being properly investigated.
So one thing that I really appreciated with your book was you put together a really comprehensive list and detailed essentially the main individuals who are accused in being involved in what took place. I put together a short list, and I'm sure I've missed a few people out, and again, I'm sure you can provide more detail, but you've already mentioned Arun Nehru, Krishan Lal Bhagat, again, he's another who's named as being pivotal and witnesses say they saw him, Gabal Nath for influencing the police, I think you've already mentioned Narasimha Rao, again, a high profile politician. And then obviously you've got people like you've mentioned, like Sajjan Kumar and Jagdish Taitlo, who are probably more known to the diaspora. Now, you mentioned Sajjan Kumar's arrest earlier. Is that a sign of justice finally happening, or is he just essentially like the sacrificial lamb, as in he's getting old? Kind of, there's been this huge pressure for something to happen or for the state to look like they're doing something, um and he's the one who's kind of like been led to the slaughter, rather than there being some type of system that's actually going to work through the whole kind of backlog of cases and everything else that is kind of still lingering from 1984.
I think in terms of Sajjan Kumar, it was so obvious his involvement and his party men's involvement, whereas the other leaders had done a really good job in not just covering up, but help getting the police to intimidate witnesses and so forth. Whereas with Sajjan Kumar, we had really strong witnesses in terms of the women who couldn't be ignored. So I think that's one of the things with Sajjan Kumar. But I just really want to start from the top. Really, we need to talk about Rajiv Gandhi first of all, and his role, which in effect, although he'd lost his mother, he really looked to the other way, and he was very indifferent to the violence that was taking place, carried out by his own men. So that's the first thing. You can see that he laid the ground for this to take place. He refused to call out the army on the 31st of October. If they were called out on the 31st, this would not have happened. So that's the first thing. Secondly, he then promoted the very leaders who were involved in the massacres during the elections and promoted them, a couple of them to high office, cabinet ministers, and the others were allowed to run for the Congress party. So in fact, this was a Congress-led pogrom to start with. So you have Rajiv Gandhi, then you have his home minister, Narasimha Rao, in charge of the police and the army, Arun Nehru, and then if you go below that, then you have these local leaders, the likes of Bhagat, who was in charge of East Delhi, Sajjan Kumar, Jagdish Taitla, and a whole load of local MPs, and then below that you have the local councillors who were also involved, and then you have the mobs. So you have local criminals that known to the Congress Party who were brought together on the night of the 31st. And on the 1st of November to say, right, you've got the green light. And then the lists of Sikhs were distributed on that night. Sikh households were marked to be targeted with an S, so that the next day, people know where to go. The kerosene was available. The mobs brought in on buses into Sikh neighborhoods. Gurdwara was attacked first, and then the police would go in, as I explained, confiscate weapons, and then the mobs would go in. So from a political point of view, this was a government organized from a senior Congress-led angle, but at the same time, there was also something else that was happening as well, because it's very easy just to say, oh, it's just the Congress and it's the government, and you forget about the actual mobs and the neighborhoods. So the mobs were made up predominantly of Hindus. These were Hindu mobs who were, on the one hand, organized by the Congress Party, but there were many mobs that were not, but they wanted to exact revenge on Sikhs. There was lots of other things that was happening in terms of, the motives in some areas, land grabbing, in some outskirts of Delhi, um, and also the feeling that Sikhs needed to be cut down to size, as well. In some areas, neighbour did turn upon neighbour, but other areas, neighbours saved Sikhs. So you've got to be really remember that the two things were happening at the same time. Lots of Hindus protected Sikhs, and Muslims protected Sikhs to, against the mobs. When the other areas, they were part of the mob. So it's not just clear cut, you know, political organization. It's also on the ground what was taking place.
No, definitely. It's not just black and white. With all of the podcasts, I post out normally before I'm recording to the community that obviously this podcast is coming up. This is the topic. Are there any questions that you would like me to put to the guest? And one person that kept being asked about was Giani Zail Singh, because he's part of the Congress. Whilst he's in power, 1984 takes place, June, November. He's there throughout all of it. And it was probably the most common sent in question. Now, could you perhaps kind of just enlighten us about, like, how does he fit into everything that's taking place at this point?
Yeah, Giani Zail Singh's story is quite interesting because he was a major player in Congress and Punjabi politics. And one of the reasons why Punjab was in turmoil because he was in political fights between himself and other Congress leaders in Punjab. There's a Darbara Singh, who was the chief minister of Punjab in the early 80s. So there was a real tussle between the two. So I think that the genesis of what was taking place in Punjab was actually from this political infighting. He was very pro Indira Gandhi. She made him president, when she came back to power in the early 80s. I think he was home minister first, then became president. So he was really a real lackey of the Congress party and the Gandhi family. But even him, he was not. He was in the dark when the Indian army was sent into the Golden Temple. He wasn't told, and there was a period just after June where he was thinking of resigning, but he didn't. The moral thing would have been for him to resign, and he didn't. And even November, when he knew that his own party was involved in mass killing, he still didn't. He still didn't resign. There was one famous journalist who told him that he'd seen Sikhs in morgues, stacked up in Delhi, and he just cried. So he was one of those people completely, spineless, but also just wanted to stay in his kursi, his seat. Didn't want to lose his job, come what may. So it's a real sad story about him. What kind of person would do that? But there are Sikhs like that, particularly in Congress, who even afterwards protected the perpetrators. There's famous Sikhs in Congress who protected Bhagat Singh. Sorry, not Bhagat Singh. HKL Bhagat from the courts. And even today, you see Sikhs in Congress who refuse to believe that the Congress party was involved in the massacres. So Glenn, it's just not it's not black and white. There are people like that involved. But yes, absolutely, he was a sorry state at the end of it, and he did admit to his secretary before he died that he pointed the finger at the senior leaders in Delhi. So he named Sajjan Kumar, Jagdish Titler, Kamal Nath. He even said that on the night these people had met and talked about the slogan that they would use, Khun da Badla Khun. And he also said that they'd met the night after, on the night as well, with senior police leaders in Delhi. He knew full well that they were involved, but he at no stage actually said, I'm going to call these people out. So yeah, it's one of those awful stories of someone, a character who could have changed, who could have made a difference, but he refused to do that.
We've only got a few questions left, and obviously the most recent news regarding the events that took place in '84 is a lot to do with British involvement. And your chapters on this do a really good job of painting a very clear picture of what's happening. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but between 1975 and 1984, India spent something like £1.28 billion on British arms. Now, even today, that's a pretty big amount. So, what does this have to do with what's happening during 1984, both in terms of June and November? And is it as clear cut as trade deals over lives, essentially, in terms of, well, first that, and then secondly, to what extent are the British actually involved?
So I think you know the recent revelations a few years ago, where it was clear cut that in terms of June '84, you know, there were conversations, and there was um, a group of SAS that was dispatched to the Golden Temple to do survey and do some work for the army is documented. The actual reconnaissance report has suddenly gone missing, so I think there's a lot of stuff that's still hidden, and I think the government, the British government, is quite embarrassed of what taken place, particularly the Conservative government. It was Mrs. Thatcher was head of that government at the time, was very close to Indira Gandhi. She herself was, you know, a victim of an assassination just 3 weeks before Mrs. Gandhi, you know, the IRA, and the bombing in Brighton. So she survived that attack. But yeah, she was very close to Indira Gandhi. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Trade deals and arms was top of the list of this, you know, this country, as it is with, you know, the likes of Saudi Arabia, and you know, arms deals, and you know, billions of trade trumps human rights. It has done for a long time. So, but you know, unfortunately, Sikhs were sort of sacrificed for those trade deals, and even years after, you know, the government looked the other way. They took the official line that these was communal rights. They've never questioned the injustice of Sikhs. And yeah, it's one of those situations where it's very difficult for governments in the West to raise this issue to the government in India, where they want to be friends with. So yeah, I mean, I still think a lot will still come out in terms of what took place in '84 and the British government.